the U in your name. Okay.
It's Nergis.
Sorry?
French spelling. It's French spelling.
All right. So I believe that we are now live. All right. So welcome everyone for today's panel with Carnegie International. And this is actually the third panel in a panel series that is titled the Centennial Reflections on Greater Lebanon. We have a set of interesting panelists whom we will be tackling with issues that are related to Lebanon's specific security and freedoms challenges. And today's panel is entitled Security and Freedoms, Rising Concerns in Lebanon. I will briefly introduce our three panelists, and please feel free to correct me if I am wrong in any spellings, as we were just discussing with Aram. We will also be taking questions at different times from the audience who are also following up with us live. So this is in addition to the questions and to the conversation that we will be having. First, we have Nadim Houry, who's the Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative. Welcome, Nadim. We have also Diana Mallid, who's the co-founder, managing editor of Daraj, but who's also a senior journalist and documentary filmmaker. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you.
And we have Aram Nergisian, if I'm not mistaken with the spelling. This is a bit of my French. Aram is a senior advisor of the program on civil-military relations in Arab states at the Carnegie Middle East Center. And actually, a big portion of his work has been focused on the Lebanese security sector as well, which is why the insight will be also very interesting to hear. So welcome, Aram. I will directly dive actually into what we need to talk about today, because as we were preparing for this panel, we got some confirmation that 3 Lebanese citizens have been summoned to investigation again in front of the military court, but this time they will actually be physically present in front of the military court. And this is actually a discussion that's been going on in Lebanon regarding freedoms and regarding the law. The law is sometimes very vague and is very confusing to many, whether you're a journalist, you're an activist, a human rights defender, or you're actually a normal citizen that participated in a protest in the country. So this is why I think that it's very interesting to sort of dive into these questions and to talk more about the judiciary system in Lebanon. So I want to ask, first I want to try and ask Nadim this question and to see what is exactly happening in Lebanon right now. So as if we are to look at the bigger picture, freedoms and human rights wise in Lebanon, how do you see it, Nadim? What has been happening, especially in the recent months, now that it's been almost 1 year since the Lebanon protests erupted and since this whole shift in the streets in Lebanon and in the presence?
Thank you very much, Luna, for this opportunity to discuss really a very important topic. The trend that we're seeing today, it's a very negative trend of seeing increasingly journalists, actually like Diana, activists, protesters, all peaceful, being called in for investigation, has actually been going on for some years, and the numbers keep increasing. Now, the question is, why is that? There are really two main reasons. The first is Lebanon has had on its books, on its laws, particularly in its penal code, provisions that criminalize key aspects of free speech. It's criminal to actually defame or criticize the president. You can still be pursued for criminal defamation of public officials. You can actually, even Lebanon has laws that criminalize what we say in Arabic is basically provoking sectarian tension. So these laws exist on the book, and they've existed for a very long time. But what we've seen, and particularly since I would say 2015, is the authorities starting to instrumentalize these provisions to go after activists. So they never use it against themselves. They never use it against powerful, even if you actually, and I mean, I have to say, these provisions are against international norms and so forth. Even you could argue some aspects of the Lebanese constitution. But what's interesting is how they use it to repress people, and they use it strategically. And we've seen in the last few years an exponential increase in numbers, and I'll give you some figures, of the number of people being called in for investigation. And we're also seeing an expansion of the field that is being used, increasingly with the emergence of the Cyber Crimes Bureau. It's a unit within the internal security forces that has really been playing a key role of calling people in for interrogation over Facebook posts, Instagram, or Twitter. Just to give you an example, in 2015, the Cyber Crimes Bureau called in and investigated 341 people. Now, this was a dramatic increase compared to the year before. You asked me why 2015? Because this is when the You Stink movement was actually, was very high. I'll give you another statistic that's very interesting and shocking. In 2018, the numbers from the Cyber Crimes Bureau had increased to 1,451 people investigated in 1 year. That basically means every day the Cyber Crimes Bureau is investigating 3 people for things that they may have posted online. Now, why this dramatic increase in 2018? Because we had elections. We had parliamentary elections in 2018, and they decided to scare people. Now, in Lebanon, we're still relatively lucky that ultimately very few people end up being convicted to go to jail. But that's not to minimize the impact and the use of these provisions, because in many interviews that were conducted with people who were called in, first of all, many people go into pretrial detention, even though that's actually even against Lebanese criminal procedure. They often use moral pressure on people to force them to sign, a commitment to remove the content, even if the content is perfectly legal, or they threaten them in their livelihood. And frankly, a lot of people, particularly some of the younger protesters and activists who were detained, some people have lost their jobs. Because in Lebanon, if you get arrested by the army or the security forces, it creates sort of a bad reputation for you. Some were not able to show up to work for a few weeks because they were detained. Some of them, they were forced to give their passwords for their social media accounts. So we are seeing an attempt of trying to control these things. And unfortunately, judges, be it in the civil court or in the military court, are going along with it. Now, you could argue there have been a few courageous judges that have taken a stand and have set some good precedents of saying, we are not going to pursue this. But I would say overall, the state policy is very much repressive.
And let me also just interrupt you right there to say something that Lebanon has been considered for years as a safer haven for activists and for journalists compared to the MENA region, compared to other Arab countries, surrounding countries, where a lot of pressure is put on journalists and on media workers, where a lot of censorship is implemented. And yet we have noticed this big switch that has happened, especially, as you said, since 2015. And I want to ask you here, because we see a lot of politicians actually bring on legal cases against journalists and activists. And many of the judges, sadly, in the judiciary system act upon favors if they know one politician or another. So apparently, we can see that there's a big requirement today to rebuild a strong judiciary system to stop this political favorism system that is taking place. So where does this even start in such in a country that is going through such challenges?
Sure. Yeah, this is an essential question. I mean, I think briefly, we need to also start by changing the laws, right? If you want to become a politician, you have to have a thick skin. So you cannot go around, and this is not me saying it, these are the international norms and how they're being applied. No one should go to jail simply because they criticize a politician, including even if they insulted a politician. Now, the second issue is, yes, the role of the judiciary. Look, I think it's no surprise the judiciary, like actually most state institutions in Lebanon, have been corrupted over the years by a system of muhassasa, basically sectarian apportionment, including corruption. And basically, if you want to get promoted, if you want to get ahead, you often have to toe the line of particular politicians. Now, Does this mean every single judge is corrupt or is in line with that? No, but it just means that there's actually an overall system, particularly the higher ups you go, that are actually inherently tied between the judges and the politicians. And frankly, no one is hiding it. I mean, they call it, justice by phone, because basically it's politicians dialing up public prosecutors and judges and basically telling them, put pressure on this, release pressure on this, wait on that. But there's also petty corruption. I mean, most lawyers in Lebanon would tell you, it's actually quite known. If I want to bring a lawsuit against another citizen, I will slip a few $100s to the police or the judges. They're calling the person on Friday afternoon for interrogation. Guess what? Then they go on weekend and the person has to sleep for 2 nights in a cell in the police. It's a way of putting pressure. Now, since 2006, there have been some interesting efforts domestically by judges and by civil society, by some courageous judges, particularly some in the younger generation, to try to create a bit of a buffer of this. They did something called the Nadi al-Qudat, a judges club. There's also been efforts really being led by Legal Agenda and others to really strengthen the independence of the judiciary. On the one hand, it has promoted and created a much richer conversation in society. And today, the independence of the judiciary has become a key demand of the contestation forces, of the revolution forces. And I think that shows that we've come a long time. Before 15 years ago, we were not allowed to have this conversation because supposedly judges were above any criticism. That has changed. On the other hand, we've seen, and we continue to see to this day, that the internal reform movement has not won the day yet. And the instrumentalization of the judiciary and the highly politicized nature of the judiciary is still very much available. And let's take some very concrete examples. I mean, over the last year, there have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of protesters that have been injured and hurt. Who led the investigations? Is anyone in jail? Let's take, when was the last time Lebanon's judiciary resolved a single politically motivated crime in this country? Never. They never get to the bottom of it because they always end up doing a deal and suddenly the file disappears. And again, it's the judges and the political system around it. And frankly, the military court has been an essential element of this politicization. If you want to take an institution where they turn it on and off, unfortunately, it's been the military court, which has been used. Again, a military court is supposed to be simply for intra-military issues, desertion, there's no business for the military court prosecuting and trying protesters. They've gone to as far as basically using the military court. If I have a traffic accident with the military and it's a private dispute, he's off duty, we may end up actually in front of the military court. So I think it's a jurisdiction gone wild. And I also want to say, second point is, unfortunately, international efforts to support judicial reform and legal reform have failed miserably. And they have not also been sufficiently transparent to shed light on why these things have failed. So the millions that have been spent on training of the judiciary, on trips to take them to Paris, to Washington, to see these things, why not? This is all good, but if we start seeing accountability. But when it comes to it, actually our judges are generally well trained. It's just they're not feeling sufficiently empowered to take on the difficult cases. And to this day, try getting a copy of a court case. I mean, we're still operating, with the old files that you remove it and so forth. Like everything else in the public institution, the institution has been rotting. And again, I think that the main address is the sectarian muhasasa, which makes it very hard to hold anyone accountable or to remove any corrupt person from their position.
And I also want to add on that, before we move to talk a bit more about freedoms and about also Diana's experience, because Diana herself, her team, and different people around her have been through these types of questioning. But before we even go through that, we want to try and understand the chaos in Lebanon, because we have so many institutions as you said, sometimes it's the military court, sometimes it's another security bureau that calls someone up, an activist, a journalist, and tells them that you're invited to have a cup of coffee. Sometimes it's an officer who notices a photographer in a protest and, who tends to ask around and to check who the identity of this person is, if he was taking pictures or not. So how can we have a setup of roles in Lebanon for the security institutions? Because within this chaos, it's impossible to know who are we slandering, if we are slandering anyone, or who are we allowed to ask questions, or who are we allowed to approach or not. So how can this setup be defined? And actually, one more question: who holds these institutions accountable once they break the laws when dealing with us, the people, either in questioning, either in protests, in any kind of incident or life event?
So I think there are two levels to your question about chaos. There is, because I'm not sure it appears chaotic to us, but for them it's actually very intentional, because they each have, it all starts making sense if you think of each security institution is somehow tied or related to a sectarian zaim, or developed historically in a particular context as a counterpoint. So the reason why we have, for instance, for al-Ma'lumat, the information branch of the ISF that developed, this was closely allied with March 14th. Other people said, well, military intelligence has this allegiance or that allegiance. When political parties such as the Free Patriotic Movement and so forth re-entered the state, they said, well, what is going to be our share? So then they actually dusted off one of the security agencies, Amn al-Dawla, state security, which had been sort of really reduced, and they beefed it up. And by the way, that multiple configuration can all be seen, for instance, in the security arrangements at the Beirut port. All of them had some presence, and all of them were coexisting. It's because ultimately the chain of command is not what, on paper it may look a certain way, but in practice, each chain of command, each officer knows very well who they owe their position to. Now, and I suspect Aram will talk about it, there have been attempts to professionalize some aspects of the army and the security forces. And, and again, my experience as an activist in Lebanon is to say, on certain things, yes, you can see some degree of professionalization, but very, very limited. When it comes to accountability, it doesn't matter. It's actually all sectarian protection. And I talk about very concrete examples. Officers that, we had worked and documented, for instance, in the ISF, the Drug Repression Bureau, that were responsible for torturing Lebanese, people that they have arrested. By name, the evidence was clear. They were not super high ranking, and they were violating Lebanese law and Lebanese code of procedure of the ISF itself. They were not held to account because their boss, their sectarian boss, decided to protect them. Now, so you have these institutions, but then you have some institutions that really, even on paper, have a weird existence. And because we're talking about protests, I have to mention here the Haras Majlis Nuwab, the famous, or the infamous, I should say, parliamentary police. They exist in a tiny, tiny text. It's not clear who they're accountable to. And you basically have a former Minister of Interior saying, as if they're not accountable to the ministry either. And recently, again, when they opened fire on protesters, you have basically the army and the internal security forces saying, it wasn't us, go see with the parliamentary police, as if parliamentary police exists on a different planet or in a different country. So this is one example where the texts are not very clear and need to be reinforced. Now, to go back to your last question on accountability, and I'll try to be very quick. Technically, there is two forms of accountability. You can have disciplinary measures, and those tend to happen within each security institution. So, and these measures on paper, again, exist, and they do get applied, for instance, if someone doesn't show up to work in the army and so forth, or if someone commits a mistake. But when it comes to politically related crimes or misbehavior or against the protesters, we see that often these internal disciplinary measures do not work. And back a few years ago, I exchanged many letters with the Lebanese army. We were following up on allegations of torture that led to actually killing of a number of suspects. And we never managed to get an answer. The army basically says, we've taken care of the problem. There's nothing to see here, go away. But they owe it to the Lebanese population to be more transparent. And then you have judicial accountability. Security forces, the Lebanese law apply to them. So if they use unnecessary force, if they torture someone, if they shoot at protesters, the Lebanese judiciary has the full authority to actually investigate. And here again, we see that if there's a lot of pressure, they will say, we are opening an investigation. And then that investigation basically dies very quickly. And what creates, it's a cycle of impunity. So you can go all the, and I've heard that argument made to me, over 20 years ago, actually even more than 20 years ago, the army had opened up on a fire on a protest, which was mostly Hezbollah protesters at the time, and killed a number of people. Ultimately, no one was held accountable. A few years later, they opened fire in Tripoli on a protest coming out. And again, some protesters died. And also no one was held accountable. And one of the arguments I heard was, well, we didn't hold them accountable last time. Why should we hold them accountable this time? And we've been living with this for the last 30 years, which brings us back to, the fundamental problem with accountability in Lebanon is a culture of impunity that was created at the end of the Civil War through the General Amnesty Law. We basically accepted that no one was held accountable to the past. The idea was, okay, but then you're going to start holding them accountable for everything that happens after today. But they understood it to mean the blank check you gave us for the past is a blank check for the future again. And this is the dilemma we are facing today about how do you break it. And I think the right call is by having it as a central political demand, accountability, accountability, accountability as a basis of a new political order. Because there will not be, in my view, and I say that with a lot of sadness after 10 years of trying to work on it, there is not going to be a technical solution to accountability in Lebanon. It has to start by a political decision, political will, forced on this corrupt political class by protesters and people wanting radical change.
And this is actually a slogan that we've been seeing on and on in protests that demanded the accountability for security forces for their excessive use of violence and also for their investigations with the media, which brings me to Diana, because I want to ask you some journalistic questions. Thank you so much, Nadim, and we're going to go back to you, I'm sure, with some discussion questions. But from a journalism point of view, and I'm a journalist myself, and we've noticed in the past months that something has shifted in Lebanon. Something shifted in the streets, something shifted in the way we write and in the way we cover things. Now, I spoke to some people, some journalists who said that we don't want to get in trouble so that we can continue doing our work. Others simply told me that we are tired of fearing an investigation. So in your opinion, is the Lebanese state today more authoritarian than it was before the October 2019 protests?
Well, the answer is definitely yes. At least it's trying to be. Let's put it in the bigger picture, because Nadim had given a really excellent analytics of what's happening internally. But if you look at the bigger picture, what happened after 2011 till today, you will witness that after the Arab Spring and the counter-revolution, unfortunately, the axis of evil of authoritarian regimes and backward leaderships have won. And unfortunately, in countries like Syria, Iraq, Egypt, the slogan that trades security versus freedom have succeeded sometimes, not necessarily by convincing people, but by imposing that if you want stability and security, you have to give up certain freedoms, whether personal or public. And that occurred in so many countries. And we've seen journalists, opinion leaders, opposition figures going either to prison or being killed or die in prison. And that we have examples. Lebanon has been affected. The axis of evil powers who have won in several countries, not only in the region, but in the world. If you look at the leadership we have globally today between Putin till Trump, between the far right, you will see the rise of the will of suppressing more and more people and undermining the freedom of speech as to reach the level, it's defamation, it's not freedom of expression. Lebanon definitely have been affected by this plague. In October, during the revolution, we have witnessed something really important, which is people have destroyed all walls of fear, that they have faced all authorities in Lebanon, all leaders in Lebanon, that we have reached the level of insulting and defamation. And that shook the core of the authorities on all levels in Lebanon. And this is why the counter revolution of October 17 have started. We've seen people being arrested, being even beaten up on videos, like the campaign that was spread in the areas of Hezbollah control, where you will see the slogan, قبل السحسوح وبعد السحسوح, which means those who have insulted certain leaders, whether Hezbollah, Amal, or others, get beaten up and shown on videos, and that was spread on social media to deter people from facing the real authority in the country. Also, we have another phenomena, which is the army. You have spoken about arrests and military court, but also there's a phenomena within the media. If you have noticed, in the past few weeks, whenever there's a protest, we have seen a tendency among the media outlets and some reporters on field. They try to discipline protesters. If you see a protester coming up and saying something really sharp or maybe insulting towards a certain leader, even against the army, the reporter immediately will cut the protester and will try to rephrase the sentence and trying to say, no, the army is really doing well, or this leadership, we didn't mean to insult it. This is not acceptable. If protesters are expressing their views, it's not the role of media to filter this up or to portray it in a way, no, nobody is talking about the authority. This has been trend in live transmission in mainstream media. So yes, with the examples you have mentioned towards military court, towards the number of how many people have been arrested and questioned because of what they express on social media or what they write, is really unprecedented in the recent history of Lebanon. And this is the real battle. You know, in Lebanon, we used to enjoy environment, no more environment, it's all polluted. We used to say to have that we have a free economy, we have banks. We've been robbed by till the last penny in our pockets. All the examples that has been used that Lebanon is really a good example, we've been deprived out of it. We still have relatively freedom of speech. This is the real asset of Lebanon. And this is what the current authority, all branches of authority, legal and not legal, trying to take out of us. If we lose this battle, we lose the meaning of Lebanon.
And I'm afraid to actually ask this question, but how have these changes actually affected journalism and media? Do you feel in your work in this sphere every day that there are more unsaid statements, there are more restrictions, journalists are really thinking once and twice before publishing a piece, stating an opinion?
The answer is mixed, because yes, we do see this trend, but at the other time, no, you can find people who are coming more bold and more expressing themselves. It's not unusual when you see after the port explosion on August 4, on August 8, you see people coming to the streets holding hangers, targeting all leaderships of Lebanon. So also you have to witness both sides. Well, because the media in Lebanon is part of the polarization, and because of the ownership of the mainstream media, which belongs to mainly either sectarian groups or political groups, so the rhetoric of these media outlets is really contained. But there are really good journalists in Lebanon, and we see alternative media, whether through certain individuals or certain groups or new platforms that are coming out, or sometimes people just doing videos and spread it on social media. I still remember vividly when leader of Hezbollah came after the protests of October 17 and saying the protesters are financed by certain embassies. Within hours, we have seen a video, young men and women replying to this accusation, saying, أنا ممول الثورة, I am the financer of the Thawra, claiming the right of revolting against this leadership. Till today, whenever there's a leader coming out, whether President Aoun, any politician, immediately they address the October 17 protests. From one side, they are trying to gain popularity, but from the other side, they are trying to attack it. They call it thugs revolution sometimes, or it's defamation revolution. They all, every time, in every statement, they try to accuse the protest because they used insults and sharp words against the authorities. And as Nadim said a few minutes a while, that it's the right of the people to express these opinions. Yes, freedom of speech enables people to say even harsh words, even insult against those who are in power. And this is something that the leadership and the authorities in Lebanon are trying to manipulate and play by. So we are in the middle of this battle. We are seeing people becoming more cautious and more afraid, but we are seeing also others who are becoming more and more bold, because we've seen it. They have bombed us. What else? What are we waiting for? They have bombed us, literally. 300,000 people have been affected by the port explosion. We have witnessed that corruption kills. It's not only militants or corruption killed us, besides many, many other things. Until today, we just had an explosion an hour ago in South Lebanon. Repeatedly, we have been seeing fires. So until today, we cannot form a government because we're fighting over sectarian shares. So really, if you don't face those thugs that are running Lebanon, how will you put them into accountability? Yes, accountability is key. Judiciary is key, but media should play its role. We have brilliant individuals, we have brilliant initiatives, and this is what we should count on and enhance, because this is how we can put those thugs in power into accountability.
And I also want to ask you, Diana, because you mentioned this, you mentioned the interrogations. Nadim spoke about sort of the legal part and what has been happening, but we met together many times on the ground in protests where we were both supporting other fellow journalists who were being investigated. So if you can just tell us briefly, when they call someone in, and you've met with judges and judiciary people, why are they calling people in? Why are they calling journalists in the same way that other people are called in for investigation, when you don't know who's calling you, you know, which authority is calling you, or what did you actually do and why are you being called in? So as someone who's been there, if you can tell us a little about it.
Well, this is part of what Nadim and you were discussing a little bit ago, which is the political influence upon judiciary in Lebanon. And we have seen it. I mean, look at what happened last week. The Speaker of the House issued a lawsuit against 2 journalists and 1 activist because they criticized the parliament police, who have been approved repeatedly that they have targeted protesters violently and with no right. Some protesters, by reports by approved doctors, have permanent injuries because of what the parliament police have done to them. So when journalists come out or activists come out and criticize this, we have the speaker, the second representative in the country, coming out and using and abusing the law and the judiciary system to put journalists into accountability and not vice versa. Till now, we don't have any lawsuit against the parliament, except the one that some brave lawyers are trying to pursue, but the judges are not looking at it. So yes, we have an imbalance of power. We have politicians are trying to abuse their power and trying to abuse the system and the judges that they have appointed to follow on journalists and other people who are coming up and speaking up against them. It's not only Berri, you have it among the Aunis. Some lawyer told us that the highest number of lawsuits against activists and journalists comes from the Aunists in Lebanon. And this is unprecedented. They are in power. What do you expect? You are in power. You, as Nadim said, you have to have a thick skin. That's a global norm. You cannot follow people because they said something here and there. So this is the battle here taking place in Lebanon.
Thank you so much, Jana. And we're going to go back to you and Nadim for some questions from the audience. But I want to move the conversation to Aram and ask a very pressing question that I had in mind for months. When we want to talk about the condition of the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF and the Lebanese army, while we're going into 2021, why are these entities and institutions being pushed into a direct confrontation with protesters all the time? Sometimes you have the LAF, sometimes you have the army. It's different. Every area has the special forces interfering with protesters. So if we can talk a little about this.
Thank you, Luna. It's useful to give some context pre-October 2019. Pre-October 2019, you had a military that basically had to service an overlapping set of mission sets, very traditional in the minds of most Lebanese senior officers. They're mainly tied to servicing the requirements tied to UN Security Council Resolution 1701 within the limits of what the political arena would allow in Lebanon, managing a new Syrian border regime and conducting ongoing counterterrorism missions. So this is all, this was the mix post-Fajr Jurud, the counter-ISIL battle. One of the net effects of a cycle of protests that has largely gone on for about 11 months now is that operationally you have 50% of the military, 40,000 men at arms, so to speak, deployed with very little rest and relief and recovery in terms of how their mission sets are organized. You have that combined with SOPs early on in 2020 on COVID-19 mitigation. And you also have the taxing effects of all of this on the ability to act proactively in a crisis situation and plan for change. The net effect of this in terms of readiness, for those who track military readiness, is you have a military that's basically at 55 to 65% readiness relative to where it was a year ago. It's also useful to think about what's changed in the enabling environment of the military. And between 2008 and 2017, you had a military that could rely on at least some autonomy to conduct those missions. And by that, what I mean is you had an enabling environment. We have this idea that sometimes that security institutions are autonomous, that somehow the LAF and the army is one branch of what we call the LAF, the others being the Navy and the Air Force. The LAF is not an autonomous structure. It's the Civil War and the pre-Civil War era. So from 1958 right up to the present have basically taught successive generations of senior LAF officers that they must abide or what they see as civilian authority. And whether that authority is in the form of elected officials, government officials, or in terms of the powers that be in the country, vacillates over time, but that norm stands. And that's also held through because of training and military education. When you have partners like the US, the UK, and others all saying the same thing, you must abide civilian authority. And you combine that with the legacy effect. The military tends to abide that. The effect of that is that post-2017, with changes in leadership in terms of presidency and composition of the Council of Ministers and shifts tied to parliamentary politics, a lot of those mission areas have been eroded. You don't have an enabling environment. And all of that sets up a situation where you have declining morale in the force going into the October protests. I mean, 2018 was the high watermark when it comes to Lebanese defense spending as a dollar amount. And from there, along with government cuts tied to the budget crisis, we are looking at a negative trend in spending on defense. And this comes as entitlements are also shifting. And we tend to look at the Lebanese military, the LAF, as just this monolithic block detached from society. But in most cases, it's useful to remember that in 2018, military personnel could rely on the military to subsidize 85% of the tuition costs of their children. For officers, that also meant things like tuition abroad and private education. By 2019, well before the protest movement, that had been slashed back to 45%, and without any allowance for international education. In 2020, before you had the slip in terms of the value of the Lebanese pound of the dollar, that was slashed to 5 million pounds per year per child. So in parallel to all of these socioeconomic pressures and governance challenges that you've been discussing in this panel, you have a military that has also been dealing with its own mix of micro and macroeconomic pressures. And this is all before you even start talking about COVID-19. At the beginning of this pandemic, the military had done arguably better than most institutions at sticking to and abiding its own standard operating procedures on COVID mitigation. As an example, you had 30 active cases in the LAF on August 4th, the date of the explosion. By September 1st, that number skyrocketed to 270 active COVID-19 cases. This in part reflects the chaos that follows, but also the fact that the military, which is not a rescue and relief organization, let alone one that's supposed to do disaster risk management, is dealing with government institutions that by choice or by design are not equipped or choose not to show up, so to speak, when it comes to the DRM role they're supposed to play. So if you ask, where are we now? You have an escalating crisis tied to healthcare in the military with 535 cases, double the amount on September 1st as of yesterday. So what does this all point to? And I'll close with this. You have a price of when it comes to civilian misuse of the military. And I can't stress this enough. This is not a military in the post-1990, let alone the post-2005 context, that acts autonomously the way other militaries in the region do. They realize, and successive generations of senior officers realize, that there is a band, a Goldilocks zone, within which they have to, on the one end, maintain public confidence and faith, and on the other end, if they go too far in doing that, you have a political elite that will summarily work to eliminate, remove, replace senior officers. So history has taught the LAF to walk that fine line. And respect for civilian authority is not going to change. What this all means in the context of this unparalleled mix of the pandemic and the protest cycle is a mixed bag. Junior to mid-level officers in the LAF throughout this crisis of governance, crisis of representation, crisis tied to freedoms, have been and remain sympathetic, in large part to the plight of people that they look at and see as no different than their neighbor, because in most cases, they are their neighbors. The challenge is that you have a senior cohort of officers that is not equipped to deal with this cycle of change in the absence of clarity about what all of this means. I'm going to butcher Gramsci a little bit here. The old order is dying, but the new cannot be born. And the military looks at what's happening in domestic politics, tied to the existing legacy forces that have been resilient and have worked to find new ways to undermine other forms of politics. They look at the lack of unity when it comes to alternative structures, or unity that's still taking time to formulate itself. And the fact that the military looks at things like elections as a watershed for legitimacy over its role in the country. Those things are all things that are going to play out, and they're going to take time. But there are a few things I'll close with that are persistent challenges that you've all been touching on. The combination of macroeconomic, microeconomic, COVID-19, and other governance pressures have all made it such that, at least at the platoon level, in some instances, you're going to see a failure of discipline. Where you have, in my mind, a lack of creativity on the part of the Lebanese armed forces. And I don't mean this just as a criticism, it's just they are in reactive mode as opposed to proactively mitigating any of this, is that they don't do enough to highlight that they are taking disciplinary action, and they do so consistently. They don't do enough when the parliamentary police or the parliamentary guard, which, as you've described, operates with even less oversight than other institutions in this country, adopting, Donetsk-style false flag tactics. I mean, one of the things that has shocked me is that unit has worn BDUs that look somewhat like Lebanese Armed Forces BDUs, battle dress, without insignia. They beat up people in the streets. And in my discussions with the military, they make it clear, yeah, that's not us, we've checked. The failure there is in making it clear to the public at large who is and who isn't administrating security, what is actually happening in Beirut with units like this. And this comes back to that Goldilocks zone. You have a senior leadership that domestically and internationally is being told, you better watch out. There's such a thing as civilian authority. And there's a view within command now that to publicly address or go beyond in terms of talking to the public about what the military's intentions are, what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what that means for interaction with other units like the parliamentary police. That's the purview of civilian authority over the military.
And I think that is needed in Lebanon, but sadly there is no transparency, because as Nadim said, and as Diana, and I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but because I still want to try to touch base on two more things. But as both of them said, we face problems in Lebanon with security forces. And when we as citizens, and not as journalists or activists or any sort of that, ask for answers, we are not given anything transparent. We are given tweets on Twitter. We are given statements by the military that are so vague that really don't serve as an explainer that someone was held responsible or accountable, and that people do make mistakes when it comes to that. But I also want to ask you one more thing, and if we could be a little brief about it regarding military forces. And it's something that has dawned right now, but also Diana and Nadim, feel free to touch base on that. Do you think that because of the presence of an external armed party in Lebanon, which is Hezbollah, and we need to tackle the elephant in the room, that sometimes the army is not being outspoken about mistakes that are happening within that institution, because the army is already sharing a border. The army is not in full control of the security in Lebanon. So is the army at a certain point, or armed forces, in fear that this might jeopardize what they are capable of reflecting for the people, the presence of a weaponized political party? And I'm going to have to ask anyone who has to answer to be a little brief, because we're running short on time.
Yeah, look, bottom line here is the military in Lebanon sees its role tied to any faction, including Hezbollah, as trying to basically buy time until a new modus vivendi, a new arrangement can emerge. And I don't think military leaders and planners have any illusions about this. They can't shift the fact that it's a political party that exists in the parliamentary domain, has engaged in politics, represents a broad enough group within its constituency, and at the same time enjoys the kind of strategic support and linkages beyond Lebanon that make this too big to take on in terms of just force funds. This isn't about whether the LAF is stronger than Hezbollah or Hezbollah is stronger than the LAF. That's always been a false dichotomy for me. Tactically, it's a no-brainer. Operationally, the LAF is a military. It's not the same thing as Hezbollah. But for the military, there's always going to be a limit. If there's not going to be some grand bargain at the international, regional, and domestic levels that addresses Hezbollah as an institution that has weapons, then that's not the purview of the military. Again, these officers don't exist in a vacuum. They're dealing with the cumulative lessons learned, some really good, some really bad lessons learned, that go from basically 1958 until the present. And that the main headline is, we can't do this. This is something that at best we can create grounds for displacing the narrative. And in the minds of a lot of those senior officers, some who are still in the military, many of whom have retired, the idea is the more credible we become and the more stable Lebanon is, the less credibility Hezbollah has for its narrative. But we're not in that environment now. You're in an environment now in Lebanon where a lot of the most disruptive officers who were about being proactive and taking risks, are no longer in service. They've been gone for 3 years. And then now what you have is officers who are basically like runners in a relay race. They just want to get the baton to the next generation, and they're not sure how to do it safely.
Thank you, Aram. I want to touch base and try to touch base on a few of the interesting questions that were asked by the audience. So I want to maybe ask this one for Nadim. It's an interesting question. Where is the balance between freedom and security? The two are not always compatible. And this question was actually addressed to you, Nadim. Can we choose between freedom and security, or is there somewhere to balance between both of them?
First of all, I actually don't think we need to choose. And laws and lawyers and judges have actually been for years clarifying how these two interact. Let's make it very, very concrete. What's clear? No one is allowed legally, no one is protected if they are inciting to violence. If I call to do that, human rights law, international law will not protect me. Let's look at now this issue that everyone talks about, insulting or defaming public figures. So we still have it in Lebanon. Criminal defamation is a crime. But in practice, if I insult a private person, it's their right for them to sue me in civil court. Now, if I defame a public person, they have also the right to protect their reputation, but let's go to civil court. And if I'm, found to actually have lied about the person, then, I would have to pay damages to harm they've done to their reputation. There are thousands and thousands of court cases from across the world that establish very clearly these precedents. I think the issue in Lebanon isn't the tension between freedom and security. I want to go back to for me, it's this issue. It's instrumentalizing laws to repress. Now, they don't do it to the same way they do it in Syria or Egypt, but it doesn't matter. What they're using provisions. I mean, let's take one provision, inciting sectarian tension. Who in Lebanon has been inciting sectarian tension the most over the last 30 years? This actual political class. Have they ever pursued it against one or the other? Of course not. They just pull it out of their hat when they want to attack someone for criticizing them. So I think the issue today isn't freedom and security. Really, the basis is it's freedom to criticize. If there's a personal insult to a private citizen, sue me in a civil court. If you're a public official, you better have a thicker skin. You can still sue in a private court, but don't use criminal procedures to silence me. And let's just stop that. And I think secondly, the issue of security in Lebanon. Everyone talks about protests actually creating chaos. What is the real cause of insecurity today in Lebanon? Isn't it the corruption of the security forces, which have left us and the entire state institution that actually become a public health danger? I mean, when you leave the amount of explosive in the port for 6 years, isn't that the issue of security? Or actually when you have people shooting in the air and bullets are falling back on people and killing them while they're safely walking in the street, isn't that public security? I really think, at least for me, the framework for this is clear enough, and it's just a misuse by the authorities, let's say by the security force, by the authorities.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadim. I want to to ask Diana, since we have this, we have the investigations coming in soon in front of the military court. Briefly, if we may say, what do you think is the right way to proceed freedoms-wise now? We're not talking about the law or all of these things that Nadim has mentioned that need to be tackled. We're not talking about the security forces, which Aram said is a bigger story than just a timely matter to deal with and to change. But as people in the domain, as Lebanese, what needs to be done freedoms-wise to try and protect one's freedoms?
We should keep pressuring that. I mean, first of all, people need to know their rights. The Lebanese constitution give us the right to express our opinion freely. We have to stick to constitution. We have to educate ourselves and tell people their rights. Many people don't know their rights when they go to investigation. They don't know that that many of what has been going on with them is not legal and they can object it. But unfortunately, they are not aware enough. We need to keep pressuring. We need to keep the media aware. We need to keep protesting if needed. We need to coordinate with bodies and institutions that are working on freedom of speech, different bodies, whether media institutions or legal ones. I think it's a long battle and we have just started. And this is something we need to keep the discussion about it alive. Because this is our right, and this is something that we cannot give up. This is where the importance of Lebanon lies.
Thank you, Diana. So, yes, we actually have a question from one of the panelists to another. So Nadim is interested in asking Aram about, and I will quote unquote read, the impact of army. Of devaluation of salaries of soldiers. Is there a contingency plan, and is the army leadership worried?
You've basically had a structure in place for months now, where as needed, command is doing advances on pay. It's not a solution. It's not a panacea. It is degrading morale. It is degrading discipline. It is making it very, very difficult. And it's why we're going to see more and more of these little instances like what we saw on September 12th. So I don't want to belittle it in terms of its significance, but by little, I mean, we'll have one or two individual cases of enlisted personnel or NCOs losing their cool. It's because their economic situation combined with no relief. I mean, I'll give you an example. In 2011, when you had major operations that I was privy to in the South Litani sector, all personnel got 72-hour furlough to go home, see their families, decompress. That cycle has been severely disrupted. You add to that the economic effects of this. It's something that is actively being mitigated on a day-to-day basis. The silver lining, Nadim, is the following. So long as the personnel in the military see their lot in life as being as good, and in many cases better, than their fellow citizens, then they often feel they have a moral obligation to just keep at it. That's why there's been a lot of speculation of things like, when does the army revolt? Well, it doesn't revolt so long as it's living in most cases as badly as everyone else. And when you've seen salaries get wiped, I mean, the effects on senior personnel is that they can't finance the higher education of their children. The effect on younger officers is they can't keep their young children in school. But that's everyone's lot in life now in Lebanon, and it's going to progressively get worse, but it's not going to be out of step in my mind with the notion that there are still some entitlements there that warrant staying true to remaining in uniform. I hope that addresses the question.
Thank you, Aram. And I think that Nadim is shaking his head in approval. It's almost 6 p.m. and we're almost at the end of our panel, but there are so many questions that we wanted to ask. The audience had some questions about the US sanctions and about what this means to Hezbollah, and there were different questions regarding freedoms and the movement in Lebanon. But I also urge everyone who's watching to take up these questions to Twitter, for those of us who are active on Twitter, and to keep the conversation going there, because this is not something that will end today. The sanctions are in place right now. The conversation about the army and the security forces is ongoing, and we have people who are sadly summoned to investigation on weekly basis, in addition to the human rights challenges and surprises that are never ending in Lebanon. So I want to thank you all for this very informative panel. Aram, thank you so much for joining us from overseas. I know there's a time difference between us, but thank you so much for making this happen. And thank you, Gianna. Thank you, Nadim, for your insightful point of views.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Carnegie for hosting.